Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
Hi. Today we're going to talk to one of my colleagues from UAB, Dr. Jennifer Young. All right, welcome, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
Good. Great. Enjoying my solitude here.
Right? It's the perfect problem for so many of us English professors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
We were
exactly.
born for this.
So we're going to discuss two stories: "The White Heron" by Sarah Orne Jewett and "Desiree's Baby" by Kate Chopin. So why don't we talk about The White Heron first, because that's the first one in the anthology, I guess.
Yes.
What strikes you as particularly interesting about this story?
What I really love is that piece of what we talk about as local color or regional writing that really kind of first and foremost is about giving that sense of place, and that sense of place in the landscape kind of context, in the sense of seeing the space, this coastal kind of slightly inland from the coast area of Maine, is something that I think Jewett just does beautifully. She really captures that whole feeling. But part of what I really love about it is that kind of the natural landscape descriptions that I think she just does so beautifully. And speaking as somebody who would have been pretty typical for her readers, I've never been to Maine. I've never been north of,
Yeah.
I've never seen anything on the Atlantic north of Fort Lauderdale,
Boston,
I
maybe?
think.
Yeah.
So this is not a region I'm familiar with. But I feel like I know exactly what it looks like reading this text, and especially by the end, toward the end, not the very, very end, but toward the end, the point at which Sylvie sneaks out early in the morning and sees the sunrise from the top of a tree it's just a really magical section. So for me, that's like the highlight.
Yeah, and without giving away the ending, what really stuck out to me as I was rereading it yesterday is the imagery of the bird imagery that Jewett weaves into the descriptions of everything, especially like toward the end as Sylvia is like climbing that tree. You get like the tree, or her hands are described as like talons,
Yeah,
you
little
know, and
claws.
yeah, so so it's really cool how she works that imagery through the story, so you're always thinking about birds.
I'm actually underlined those portions where you're talking about right now. Those really stuck out to me too, that she really does develop that imagery, and it's really subtle, but it's so beautifully crafted throughout the whole
Yeah,
thing.
and I think that the first time I read it, I remember like really not being sure what to think about this ornithologist guy. He's because of the way Sylvia responds to him at first, and she's scared of him, and he does seem kind of creepy and weird. Again, I'm not going to talk about what happens. Builds suspense really well with the way
Yeah,
that character is introduced.
absolutely. And I often, because as somebody who, I was never alive during this period. I'm, way younger than
Right,
that.
it was over 100 years
So
ago.
having to look up, trying to figure out why an ornithologist would even possibly, because he's also described, and I don't think this is giving too much away, he's also described as the hunter, that
Right,
same
right.
character, right? So the hunting is part of this, and for anybody who hasn't read it yet. And I often, once I kind of figured out after living in Louisiana for 10 years, one of the things I learned was about how John James Audubon, who had already completed his Birds of America series by the time this is published, this would have been the context for a kid, a young man like this, and an ornithologist who is a scientist, a specialist in birds, might hunt the birds. That's exactly what Audubon did.
Oh,
and
see, I
and
didn't know that, and that's really
yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
it's really kind of useful contextual information, because now we would think a scientist might be trying to preserve. This is an endangered. He even says, this is an
Yeah, it
endangered
says it's a rare
bird.
bird, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So the part of what, as a naturalist, in the scientific context, what Audubon would do, would he go out, he or his assistants, as he got more and more famous, would go out into the field, hunt the birds, shoot the birds, stuff the birds, and then pose them. And that's how he painted them in such precise detail, because they were
Wow.
dead. They
That
were
is
dead.
really, really, really interesting and bizarre.
But talking about, this notion of regional writing, or local color writing, was super popular at this time, and Jewett was, and has remained, somebody really highly regarded as one of the masters of this
Hmm.
specific kind of writing about place. But one of the things that I've read over the years talked about how, everybody was writing local color and publishing it in the magazines of the day. It was very popular, but the ones that last are the ones that take the local description, the sense of place, the kinds of characters, but elevate the content so that there's a universality of it. And it's
Right.
the big ending that we're sort of alluding to here, this big twist ending, which is both indicative of the short story form generally. It was kind of a convention of it already, the twist or the surprise at the end. But the added moral dilemma that's central, and that's exciting. It's really
Hmm.
exciting to see. And it's something that, whether you've been to Maine, or you like nature, or you don't, everybody can kind of remember moments in their own lives, even
Hmm.
where, growing up, where you kind of had to face authority and
Hmm.
maybe make a choice about what you're going to do in the face of authority.
Speaking of trick endings, I think that the ending of Desiree's Baby, which we also won't give away,
Mm,
is like even more surprising and weird, you know.
painful,
And
heartbreaking.
one of the things that strikes me about this story is just how simply it's told, like a fairy tale. It's maybe 4 pages long. It's almost all summary except for a few short lines of dialogue.
True, true.
And so it's just kind of once upon a time element to it, and yet it like deals with racism and misogyny and so many things that you obviously don't get in an actual fairy tale.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love, I've never thought about this in the fairy tale context. And I'm kind of ashamed of myself, actually, because later in the semester, the very last thing I typically read in my American lit classes is a story that I talk about that extensively in Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek, and the whole
Hmm.
fairy tale motif through that. So shame on me for not really recognizing, but of course it starts with a foundling, right?
Hmm.
It's a little
Yep,
girl
absolutely.
who's found. What a fairy tale motif that is, too. So I love that notion, that it has that familiarity. This one, as we've talked about, this regional or local color kind of writing, um, we learn very quickly we're in Louisiana. We're in a Creole French Louisiana, so there's a little
Hmm.
interspersing of French um, phrases here and there. They're not speaking, well, they are speaking French. We don't read it entirely in French, but we're to
Right, it's kind of
understand it.
explained in the narrative that she's translating it for us, right? That it's
Yeah, but she still sprinkles the little bits in just to remind us. I kind of love that.
right.
But I love that notion too, of that familiarity of the fairy tale structure, and
Hmm.
the way that very clearly, in that kind of retrospective, and I love that too, that sense that most of it is told in summary. There are these few snippets of dialogue in this super tight story. Thinking too about that universality of experience. Here, it's not so much about growing up and choices in that sense. But to my mind, this is such an American story because it's, am I allowed to say kind of the ultimately what it's about? I mean, the broad sense, the one word, race. This is about race in America. And we've got a story that happens not in like Chopin's present, but back in the day before.
Back in the day.
Yeah, back before the Civil
obviously before the Civil War, and she's writing after the Civil War.
Right.
You lived in Louisiana for a while, right?
10 years, yeah, in New Orleans for 10 years. So I got really steeped in a lot of the stuff in ways that I never would have had I not. I mean, I kind of threw myself into it because of other courses I was teaching, other research I was doing at that time. So I really loved Chopin's work in and of itself. The ways that she brings that kind of Creole French in is super cool. But again, that universality, because even though this is antebellum, even if it's further back and it's not even American yet, because we're dealing with a plantation story, we've got slaves, we've got questions about race. This is American insofar as, well, Louisiana, the land was always the New World. It was always America. And,
right. Yeah, absolutely.
And it speaks to her own time too, because race hadn't been solved in America in the 1890s.
It still hasn't really,
and
still hasn't.
Absolutely.
Which becomes more and more clear all the time,
Absolutely. So, and since this too, she's writing, it's something that I always have to remind myself what year it was, because I know it's right around it. 1893 is, I think, this story in 1890.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's around that time. Yeah.
And 1890s is Plessy versus Ferguson, and that's the thing that I always use as my touchstone for thinking about what was going on with race in America when these stories were happening. Well, this one is, a blink of an eye before a landmark Supreme Court case. Race in America, race in the South was a big deal for sure. So there's no sense that there's a lull at this point. They're actually in a ratcheting up period where it's really on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Certainly, I would imagine, Southerners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So to me, again, that's one of the things that I think is really tremendous. But it's also where Jewett's A White Heron is a quiet little story. This is a mind-blowing story. It's small. It's really tight, and it's it doesn't go anywhere. We're on one plantation the whole time. That's it. But emotionally, it's devastating. Just devastating. The story, and that's what's always so. And this is the twisted part of talking to English professors together, this is so cool about it, right? It's it's amazing how painful it is. It's great. And then one of the things that I think is often missed the first time we read it, any of us, is how much, and this is something I won't give away anything, but even at the end, there's still real ambiguity. We don't know everything at the end.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's cool too, I think. And the way we perceive, the way we interpret it is often a chance, I think, for all of us to kind of think about the ways that we ourselves, 120 years after this story, 130 almost years after this story was written and published the first time, how we internalize race and racism and assumptions about race, things that even if intellectually we can say one thing, our impulses, like our first assumption is something else, based on lots of arbitrary little details and information. I think that's a really cool thing about this story too, is in such a short time, there's such a chance, an opportunity to think about things that are still so relevant. And you mentioned misogyny, and that's another big piece I haven't even touched on that, huge in to some degree, maybe both of these texts, but especially this one, especially Desiree's
Yeah.
baby. So yeah, it's just tremendous. Love this stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a good amount of information for my students. So thank you so much for zooming with me.
I loved it. It was super cool. So thank you for having me. I'm really glad to do this. And everyone enjoy them because they're so good.
Okay. All right. Well, I will talk to you soon.
All right. Take
All right.
care.
Thanks again. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.